Thank you again for having me. It's great not to have had to navigate fallen branches this week. Last time, it's a fallen branch we had to cut down to get here, and then going back, there's no fallen branch, so hopefully you were all safe if you were here last week. Especially nice to see those of you who've come from further away, Crathies, and the likes, and you're especially welcome. And everybody is welcome to delve into Narnia. So last week we thought about Lewis's life, a journey that took us from Belfast, my hometown, she says proudly, where Lewis grew up, through his time in English boarding schools and then Oxford, where he studied classics and philosophy before settling in English literature as his area of specialism in Oxford as a Don. And internally he travelled much more convoluted path from teenage atheism, with a distinct preference for belief in the material world, through various philosophical perspectives, settling eventually and reluctantly on a belief in a supernatural God, and eventually then the God of Christianity. And having converted in his early 30s, sometime in the early 1930s, he seemed to have some of his ideas quite well developed. So what you'll find is that although his ideas do develop, he actually is quite consistent throughout his writing. And I believe that a lot of this he got from the guides, the people that he was reading from his teenage years right through his 20s, as he thought things through and worked out what he believed. And so we have people like George MacDonald, Edmund Spencer. These ideas he absorbed and built on. And so then when he started to write in his 30s, he actually had his ideas well thought through. So last week I touched on two themes. Firstly, joy with a capital J, by which Lewis meant it was his own term, and by that he meant longing. He was into joy with a small j too, but joy with a capital J was about longing, and he believed it's in all humans, and he concluded it's a kind of signpost, which if we pay attention to the longing that's in each one of us, it brings us to God. And this longing will take us past desire for power, the erotic, the occult. These are all things he talks about in his autobiography. So long as we pay attention to experience and to the kind of desire, he said there's a different feel to it, then it will lead us to God. And secondly, we looked at Lewis's emphasis on each human as particular beings. And he really loved the particularity of everything. You know, a rainy day or a piece of bacon. Like somewhere he talks about eating a piece of bacon takes you back through all the other bits of bacon that you've eaten before. I think I said last week I was a bit jealous that he had a photographic memory, but imagine to be able to remember other bits of bacon that you've eaten, and just, even if you're having one piece, the other memories are all. So he just loved, the particularity of everything, and, he believed that no human is just a mere blank, a mere mortal. Each is created by God with a particular identity, which may not be visible to us as we go past each other, but is entirely visible to God. And for Lewis, in the same way the stone statues come to life when Aslan breathes on them in the land in which he ordered, so too humans come to vivid life, to colour when they're breathed on by the triune God. And so, next slide. So in the silver chair, we have the creatures of the underworld, the earthmen, and they are under a spell, and they're dull and fearful. But when the witch's spell is broken, they come to life and they realise they were enchanted. And they say they hadn't sung, they hadn't let off a squib, they hadn't made a joke or danced, they couldn't think except what the witch put in their heads. We didn't know who we were or where we belonged. It was glum and gloomy. Whereas in contrast, then, so actually, yeah, we have the contrast there, but what Lewis felt is that evil brought this grey flatness to things, like the stone statues, no colour. And the breath of Aslan, he thought, brought colour to life, and that seems to have been his own experience. And I think you can even see it actually in his writing. He wrote these poems which were published, Dimer, and he wrote other poems, and nobody's ever seen them as a great work of art. So Lewis's own experience was that once things began to click into place for him, he began to come alive, and that was very much what he believed. So tonight we're going to look at Narnia in two parts. Firstly, sort of the background to the creation of it, give you some information for future reading or past reading, and then some aspects of the story themselves will focus on Aslan. So, the origins of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe might well have been relatively early in a way, 1939, because they weren't published. The first one was published in 1950. So it could well have been filtering through his brain for a long time. He did announce that he was going to write a children's story sometime before 1940. So it would seem that, well, one of the things I think that there just seems to be a lot going on in his head. He was certainly worried children, evacuees, would come out of London and stay with him at the kilns, in the household there. And he said they didn't really have much imagination. And we'll talk later about how important imagination was for him. And so the the next thing, I couldn't resist this, I don't know if I'm going to get into trouble or not. That's the lion rampant is the symbol on Aslan's flag. It's also in the Scottish royal flag, so I couldn't resist putting it there. I'm not sure if it means anything at all, which it could be where I get into trouble. I'm not trying to say anything political, I'm not trying to say anything about sport or any team. So anyway, I just couldn't resist putting it there, because that's what Aslan's army have on their flag. Anyway, Narnia, back to Narnia. So the 7 books were published in, and I don't know if you can read this, can you? Yeah. So they were published in the 1950s, starting 1950, ending in 1956. And The Magician's Nephew, which was written 6th, it tells the creation of Narnia. And Lewis did manage to mention in a letter to a child that he thought maybe, because it was the creation story, although it was published 6th, maybe the child should start with that one. And so if you're trying to work out what order to read them in, sometimes if you get a box set, it'll be ordered 2 different ways. Mostly it's the chronological order nowadays, so it's actually number 1, which is my box set, is The Magician's Nephew. And I think that might be why the Netflix people are starting with The Magician's Nephew. So Greta Gerwig, she's working on that one, that's going to come out in just over a year's time, and then starting with The Magician's Nephew. So there are 2 orders. There's the order he wrote them in, the publication order, and then the actual chronological order, the order of life in Narnia. I haven't quite settled my opinion on that one, but I think there's a lot to be said for actually meeting Aslan in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe for the first time, because it's so set up to meet him for the first time in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Anyway, last week we said Lewis was steeped in the classics, medieval and Renaissance literature, and he loved what he called the polyphonic technique, which was the interweaving of lots of layers of story. And he felt that a story could convey a lot more meanings if it's referring to other stories behind it and underneath it. And, well, I mean, that's if you know the other stories. Thankfully, his stories do stand alone well. You don't have to know the other allusions. But, you know, if you want to start reading more classical and Renaissance literature, you'll get more out of them. Anyway, Lewis was also at the same time writing his magnum opus, which is a massive tome, English literature in the 16th century, and it was published in 1954. So it's no surprise really that this series of books has, has the theme say on like a science fiction, the Narnia books are all full of Renaissance-like castles and sailing boats and battles fought with swords and bows and arrows, because that's what his head was full of. But he also was inspired by the poet Edmund Spenser, his book The Fairy Queen, which is the longest poem, I think, even now, in the English language. It was written in the 16th century. And Spenser too was part of that tradition which perceived ancient myths as having hidden meanings. And yet they were somehow aligned with Christianity. Lewis discovered him as a teenager, and I think enjoying The Fairy Queen, I think, shaped Lewis's love of what he called golden literature. He said to read Spenser is to grow in mental health. And I don't know if our mental health would be improved by reading it today. Very different bookish teenager of over 100 years ago. But Lewis did think that many a boy had discovered love of poetry through reading The Fairy Queen. I mean, you have to remember, just like that's changed. In the First World War, lots of men really loved reading Jane Austen in the trenches. So life has really changed. I think, I don't know if lots of men love reading Jane Austen now, but they did. I don't know if it was the contrast, perhaps, from the trenches, but the reading material was certainly very different. And as I mentioned last week, there's something about the First World War that seems to have changed literary taste to something much less golden. Lewis called it drab. So having lived for so many years with Spenser's fairy land, Lewis created a parallel version of his own land, and it's crammed with images of life. Narnia may be besieged, may be under attack, it may be embattled, but it is largely a golden world. And, well, when free of these dark influences that rule it. And rather like Spenser, Lewis is trying to create a sort of golden land. He's drawing in the Bible, he's drawing in classical and northern mythology, he's drawing in English literature, European literature, Irish fairy tales. In fact, he sort of draws from so many places, and sometimes it's so sort of direct that to us, to our culture now, it would seem a bit like he's stolen the idea. It's plagiarism. He'd be kicked out of university for doing it. But actually, Lewis didn't really value originality. He didn't think that was what people should be striving for. And actually, so when he uses other writers' ideas, it's a tribute to them. He's intentionally, including them if he enjoys their work. And he was also a writer of his time, so he's alluded to contemporary writers such as E. Nesbit, that's 5 Children in It. And E. Nesbit, in one of her books, she actually has a spare room with a wardrobe. So that's an example. Also to the Caramenes, they are interesting because they do talk like people out of the Arabian Nights. And in that respect, we do find ourselves in Lewis in the company of a person of his day, of his time. He's less multicultural than us. He's happy to use what was, sort of the baddies of his day. Later on, you move on a few decades, and then the Nazis become the baddies. But for him, it was these sort of Arabian characters, not Muslim, but sort of Arab-style characters. They're polytheists, and so that there is no particular people, but nonetheless, you do feel it a little bit as if Narnia is better. That world is better. He was a man of his time. And in general, as he drew from these sources, they were joyous for him, for many of his readers. Tolkien wasn't always happy with it. Tolkien loved his books to be really consistent internally, so Lewis seemed to put in random things. Tolkien really found Santa and Father Christmas turning up just, it's dreadful. That's just so inconsistent and so from nowhere. But try telling that to any child who reads the book, they're quite happy. And that's a whole other topic we can talk about. But so Lewis is really synthesizing, he's drawing ideas, he's layering meanings, but he isn't syncretistic. So he's not trying to say that all myths or all religions are equally important. He's not trying to do that. So this was something he had to work out. I mentioned it last time. Prior to becoming a Christian, this is a huge area for him that he had to work out to his own satisfaction, and that was the place of other myths and other religions in relation to Christianity, and that was part of that conversation with Tolkien. That was very significant. And his conclusion was that God has given hints all along, everywhere. I do wonder, Lumen Gentium, one of the encyclicals of the Catholic Church, actually says more or less the same thing. I'm just wondering if I've read a lot of Lewis back to him influencing theology. But his conclusion was his truth is shed abroad. Christianity is the greatest revelation of God. And so God come to earth. So for Lewis, he would talk about Christianity as the true myth. And other religions he felt were fulfilled there. So Christ was the fullness of God. And he subordinated everything to that. And as Runewit, the centaur, says to King Tyrion in the last battle, I drink first to Aslan and truth, sire, and secondly to your majesty. So in terms of imagery and emphasis, there was also references to the Bible a lot. It underpins his belief system. So you can see there he even wrote a book on the Psalms. And like it's used in the classics, the references to the Bible can be slightly buried. He's not quoting chapter and verse, since he doesn't actually say it. So for him, it's all part of the game. It's up to the reader to try to work out. But he read the Bible consistently, and it's woven through all its work. In the silver chair, Aslan says to Jill, remember, remember, remember the signs. Know them by heart. Pay no attention to appearances. Remember and believe the signs. Nothing else matters. And there's echoes there of the Israelites being told to repeat the Shema, to remember it, to wear it, to put it, to always keep it in their minds. There's definite echoes there of that. And in the Bible, a lion is a biblical image for God. And I think when Lewis wrote in the 1950s, he sort of expected that his readers would know that, And actually, he was a bit surprised at how many people didn't always understand the significance of his imagery or what he was saying, or even who Aslan was representing. I think Pauline Baines took her, she's the illustrator, and I think she was weeping over the death of Aslan, and it took her, I don't think she instantly realised, I think she did in due course. And so part of that is a culture that's already losing its understanding of Christianity, its familiarity with the Bible, but part of it might be the complexity of trying to portray the God of Christianity. So Aslan, most frequently portrayed and perceived as Jesus, because of his death and resurrection in the Languishing Wardrobe, and because he's the son of the emperor over the sea. But nevertheless, he conveys, there are other aspects to Aslan, conveying other dimensions of the three-person God. And so in the memorable passage in The Magician's Nephew, we find Aslan not in the role of Redeemer, but in the role of Creator. And theologically, Lewis wasn't trying to be precise or slapdash either. He did say the Narnia books aren't meant to be precise theology. They're an attempt to capture the sense, the feel, to get to the heart of things rather than just the head and the doctrine. So he did distinguish between his fiction books and his non-fiction writing. So I'm going to read you some extracts about Aslan, the Creator, from The Magician's Nephew. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away. Diggory found it hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. His lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words. There was hardly even a tune. But it was beyond comparison the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful he could hardly bear it. Then two wonders happened at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by the other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingly, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead all at once was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently one by one as they do in a summer evening. One moment there'd be nothing but darkness. Next moment 1,000 points of light leapt out. Single stars, constellations and planets, brighter and bigger than any in our world. There were no clouds. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. If you'd seen and heard it as Diggory did, you would have felt quite certain that it was the stars themselves which were singing, and it was the first voice, the deep one, which had made them appear and made them sing. And all this time, the lion's song, in his stately prowl to and fro, backwards and forwards, was going on. What was rather alarming was that each turn he came a little nearer. Polly was finding the song more and more interesting because she thought that she was beginning to see the connection between the music and the things that were happening. When a line of dark firs sprang up on the ridge about 100 yards away, she felt they were connected with a series of deep, prolonged notes which the lion had sung the second before. And when he burst into a rapid series of lighter notes, she was not surprised to see primroses suddenly appearing in every direction. Thus, with an unspeakable thrill, she felt certain that all things were coming, as she said, out of the lion's head. And when you listened to his song, you heard the things that he was making up. When you looked around, you saw them. Far overhead, from beyond the veil of the blue sky which hid them, the stars sang again, a pure, cold, difficult music. Then there came a swift flash like fire, but it burnt nobody, either from the sky or from the lion itself, and every drop of blood tingled in the children's bodies, and the deepest, wildest voice they had ever heard was saying, Narnia, 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 awake, love, think, speak, be walking trees, be talking beasts, be divine waters. I can't resist reading it because I just, it's really that I could just have read the whole thing instead of me talking. And actually, my sense of humour is a bit of a laugh, because if we'd watched a bit of a film in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Aslan also has a Northern Irish accent there too. It's Liam Neeson. Maybe God has a Northern Irish accent. Sorry. But Lewis is thoroughly enjoying portraying the creativity of the whole process of creation, the great creation. And in response, so it's based in Genesis 1, but what he brings in with his imagination is the responses of creation. So the stars are responding. And there's even a hint of that Renaissance idea, which might just even have some scientific backing, that there's the music to the spheres. I don't know if anyone ever heard, but the planets do actually, each one has a noise. So there is, I don't know how much many of us knew there was music in the spheres, and so, this is possibly one of the things that Lewis is alluding to there. Lewis is always fascinated by the planets, and so they creep into his work regularly. The other worlds, I think he just loved creating imaginative worlds, anything which stimulated his imagination. So space worlds, Paralandra, Narnia, and then until we have faces, he creates this ancient world called Gloom. And then, for about 9 years, I think, as a child and into his teenager years, he created a world called Oxen, which are talking animals in it. So he didn't although I think boxing has a bit of India in it, but by and large he wasn't interested in going to another country. He wanted to create the world himself. And so it wasn't, however, just about imagination for the sake of imagination. Lewis saw that myth or story could convey meaning in a way which logical argument couldn't. Perhaps that's why he moved away from the more rational books that he wrote in his midlife, because later in life he did tend to write more fiction. But even in those more rational, apologetic books, I think a lot of the power lies in his use of imagery, his understanding of metaphor. I think that's why he's quoted so much. He's not only good at the rationale and the reasoning, but actually he understands the power of metaphor and imagery. And so stories allow readers to experience an idea, like pleasure or pain, rather than just think about it in a head level. And the engagement, he believed, was more profound because it reaches the heart. And of course, he would say, I believe, that Jesus understood that. Jesus modelled that. Quite a percentage of Jesus' teaching was through story and through metaphor. And the Bible in its entirety is crammed with story and metaphor. And I think sometimes when we're reading at the English translation, we don't understand just how crafted. And so scholars are increasingly, I think, pointing out the craft that's gone into the Hebrew, the Old Testament text, and how actually very intentionally they're crafted. There's different rules to ours, but it's very intentional, very layered, very hyperlinked, is what Tim Mackey from the Bible Project always calls it. Lots of cross-references and picking up of imagery. And there is something, I think, which made it difficult, something about our late modern Western world that made it hard for Lewis to even know how to refer to this kind of literary world, full of allegory, full of metaphor, full of symbolism. So he tried lots of different terms. He would talk about a fairy story, which, and he and Tolkien would use that idea, and they said, well, historically fairy stories weren't for children, but actually for adults. And Lewis preferred that term to the term fantasy, which I think he felt suggested a bit too much escapism. And of course that term wasn't used to the same extent. Tolkien, who's really put it on the map, contributed hugely to the huge success of fantasy nowadays. In another context, Lewis talked about mythopoesis. We have another slide there on that. Yeah, mythopoesis, and that's about stories that hint at meaning, not just stories for the sake of story. And here he was influenced by George MacDonald from Huntley, who we referred to last week. And at this point, I just want to sit down and let Kerry Dearborn explain mythopoesis and imagination. But maybe at the end, you'll chip in if there's anything anybody wants to know. But George MacDonald, who wrote really two significant essays in the imagination, Lewis never really did that. I think he often just left it. If it had been done before, he wasn't good, certainly going to try and rehash it. And MacDonald's essays on the imagination are still used in universities today, if they're thinking about theology and imagination. And so Lewis MacDonald really drove home the point that God is the truly creative one. And humans can and should exercise their imaginations because they're made in the divine image. I always think, God said in Genesis, God created the world and then he made humans in his own image. And we don't really think that creativity is for everybody. But Tolkien and Lewis, they followed MacDonald on this point. They believed that sub-creators, God was the primary creator, the rest of us are just, we might be creative, but we're pale shadows, really. But it is at the core of what it is to be human. And I think Lewis was concerned in 20th century West that this was being overlooked. Imagination, however, does need reason, and reason needs imagination. So theologically, Lewis felt that abstract ideas didn't lead to transformation. And so the joint effort of the intellect and the imagination is what leads to change. But God's imagination is always primary, and his spirit enables the human to participate in God's creativity. And the artist who is close to Christ and indwelt by his spirit should therefore have a vibrant imagination, inspiration, a spiritual process. And we can see this process clearly in the Narnia Chronicles. Lewis wrote them because he had a series of images that came into his head. And these are the two in particular. The fawn with the umbrella. I think he first had a mental picture of that in his head when he was 16. So these lived with him a long time. And the queen on a sledge. And so Narnia, the place, is really important in his imagination, rather than an idea of what he wanted to communicate. And Lewis, he did at one point say quite adamantly that he didn't start off thinking he had a message. He said that's pure moonshine. Although being Lewis, the message and the meaning did come. And so he said, then, at first I had very little idea how the story would go. But then suddenly Aslan came bounding into it. I think I'd been having a good many dreams of lions about that time. Apart from that, I didn't know where the lion came from or why he came. But once he was there, he pulled the whole story together and soon pulled the other 6 Narnian stories in after him. He also said that he felt compelled to write in the genre of children's story. I'm not quite sure, Lewis said, what made me, in a particular year of my life, feel that not only a fairy tale, but a fairy tale addressed to children was something I must write or burst. And perhaps I think he kind of wonders elsewhere if it's partly because that Christian apologist, that expositor that he had been for so many years, always analysing, always rationalising, always arguing. It was he was a bit tired of that, and the imaginative side of him that was just as strong, that hadn't been given as much time, was maybe desperate to get out. Although, he thought about the role of reason and the way that reason and imagination had to work together, long and hard too. And he talks about ideas bubbling up in the mind of the author, which the author wants to pour out. And he said it nags him all day long and gets in the way of his sleep and his meals. It's like being in love. These ideas, these imaginative ideas. And then in contrast, he refers to the really rational side of himself as the man. The man decides whether the ideas are of value and whether it's a good idea. The man applied reason to the imagination. So what about the dreams and pictures? Lewis had a choice of what to do with the dreams and the mental images and that sense of compulsion. And I have a theory, although he doesn't say this, but then Lewis doesn't always say everything. In fact, he very often doesn't say the things. He was quite secretive. And I wonder if he did think of himself as participating with his divine inspiration. He had long understood the concept of participation with God. He learned it in Platonism, and he liked Platonism. He learned it from his friend Owen Barfield, who said that we participate with sort of the other. Owen Barfield wasn't specifically Christian, but Lewis would also have read it in the New Testament. In the original Greek, he would have been very aware of the Greek term there. And he portrays it in science fiction. You've got this very profound image of a dance, where everybody takes their turn participating in the dance. And in a very different way, you've got this other very different dance at the end of that Hideous Strength, the third of the sci-fi series. And so I do wonder how much Lewis thought about that. Western theology hasn't, until recently, taught so much about participation, although recently scholars are writing a lot about it. But the idea that humans were meant to cooperate with God is there from the beginning of Genesis. And I personally would love the theological scholars to tell us a bit more. How do we do it? How do we participate with God? But actually, I think Lewis is really good at it. He lived it, and he does sometimes try to show it. Lewis, I think, received these pictures, received the dreams, and trusted them, and got to work whatever way his own mind then saw was good and would work. And so it reminds me of the various Narnian children who are called to Narnia because they have a task to do. And they work with Aslan, they're given the task, and they work with him. So in the silver chair, Aslan gives Jill Pole exact, direct instructions as to what she's to do. She's given her task to rescue Prince Rilian, and they have some instructions along the way, but they must use their intelligence, their wisdom, their faith to complete the task, to do their part. They've got to keep their eyes open, they've got to remember faithfully the signs, and so they are participating with Aslan in the task. And so for the second but shorter part, I want to think briefly about Aslan. I want to direct your thoughts to him, who is, as Lewis's greatest imaginative achievement, I think we could say, is a collaboration between Lewis and God. Lewis with all those dreams of Ryan's. So Rowan Williams has written a small book, typically dense, very dense. The Lion's World is about Narnia, and it's a fair book because it's very enthusiastic, although it does point out where some critics don't like this or some people don't like that, and so it's a fair book, and it's it's important. I'm not standing up here and saying Lewis was without fault. For example, I'm not entirely comfortable with the way Lewis has Aslan treat Prince Caspian, treat Trumpkin in Prince Caspian. But having said that, I think Aslan, there are so many moments when Lewis is capturing, I think, in Aslan aspects of the God of the Bible with great dynamism. And I particularly love Rowan Williams' little chapter on this, because next slide. Rowan Williams emphasises something that I really love, and Aslan is, Williams says, and I agree, that Aslan's actually really often in the position of a rebel against the established order in Narnia, and he leads the Narnians in reclaiming or in liberating festivity. So for Lewis, he's sort of aligning this with Earth. In his science fiction, the Earth is the silent planet because it doesn't hear, it's out of touch with its true place in the spiritual order. And so Narnia is at times needing to be liberated back into its true place. So if you think about the Screwtape letters, the world of Screwtape, the demon, is dull and orderly. Everything's very, very orderly. It's flat and it's controlled. And any unexpectedness, they try to keep the lid on it. And this is a consistent theme for Lewis. God disrupts our attempts to control our own lives. He breaks in as an enemy of that dull world. Aslan is sad, he's angry, he's challenging, he's majestic, but he is often also riotous and joyful and disruptive. And there's a particularly good example of this in Prince Caspian. Aslan is liberating the Narnians from the reign of Miraz. The Pevensey girls are on Aslan's back. They're joined by a host of classical creatures, including Bacchus, who's the god of wine and festivity in ancient Greece. One character is swept up into the festivities, and all her contemporaries, she's a schoolgirl, and all her contemporaries are left behind with their tight school collars and their thick stockings. And Aslan asks her, "You stay with us, sweetheart." And she's delighted to, because although the invitation is always extended to the festivities, not everyone chooses that wildness, that disruption in their lives. And Jesus, the model and template for Aslan, did after all say he had come to bring freedom. I think all too often in church, this can be forgotten too. Readers may not exactly know what to make of Bacchus and some of his companions, but perhaps that's something of Lewis's point. Aslan's subversiveness, like that of God, is constantly surprising as he disrupts our hope for a settled life or a planned future. And Lewis has lots of ways of making the same point. Aslan is good, but he's not safe, as Mr. Beaver famously tells the children. Nor is he tame, as we're reminded in the last battle. And, those who don't know Aslan such a shifty, they try to twist that into distrust. But there's truth in the fact that Aslan isn't tame. We're also told in Man, the Witch, and the Word, think against Mr. Beaver. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. And then in the silver chair, Jill Pole has to face Aslan, and she doesn't know him. So the first time, he's sitting there very calmly, he's not being riotous at all, and she wants a drink. But Aslan will not promise not to eat her if she comes to the water to get a drink. He says, I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms. Because the point is, she must trust him. There is no other stream for her to quench her thirst. And when she does drink, not only does he not eat her up, but in fact she finds out he has chosen her. He has called her. He has an adventure into another world for her. And so even though she was the cause of Eustace falling off the cliff and so forth, and she's miserable and bullied at school, Aslan has an important task for her. She doesn't see it, she doesn't see her value, but Aslan says there's a task for her. And Jill says, I see. And Aslan says, child, perhaps you don't see quite as well as you think. There's always this idea we don't fully understand, and certainly not Aslan. There's always great mystery around him, and even when Aslan tells Jill her list of tasks that she's got to do, he says this is what you have to do, and it seems he won't be around to help her, but Aslan's visible presence to the children isn't the entirety of his presence. And nor is the wild exuberance or the riotousness the only story to be told. That's just one aspect. And although I love that aspect, that God subverts our expectations, there are many dimensions to Aslan. Some are quieter and more personal, if still unquantifiable. And so, for example, when the children are close to being eaten at the giant's autumn feast in the silver chair, Aslan appears in a dream, and it's a cryptic dream, as in the nature of dreams, but it's clear Aslan won't leave them. And so it goes on in the Narnia stories. In The Horse and His Boy, it seems that Aslan only turns up 3 times in The Horse and His Boy, but actually he's subtly there throughout and all along. And so when Shasta, little lonely Shasta's travelling along, feeling sorry for himself, something seems to be travelling beside him. And so before I conclude with some extracts from that particular chapter, I should point out, if you weren't here last week, that Aslan's breath is a metaphor for the presence of the Holy Spirit. And it's his breath that brings the stone statues alive, it's his breath that gives people rest and comfort. But also, in addition to that, there's something special about Aslan's kisses, or in the book, his licks. Aslan gives licks, he doesn't just breathe on people, he gives licks. And the kisses seem to suggest something extra, a blessing, something a bit like a biblical anointing, but always intimate and always profoundly encouraging. And so I'm going to leave you with a few extracts from that piece. It was pitch dark, and Shasta could hear nothing. And the thing, or person, was travelling beside him, that was going so quietly he could hardly hear footfalls. But what he could hear was the breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale. And he'd come to notice this breathing so gradually that he'd really no idea how long it had been there. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope he'd only imagined it. But just as he was becoming quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be imagination. Anyway, he felt the hot breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. So, just to interrupt there, Shasta, the lonely boy, who doesn't know who he is invited to speak to Aslan. And the thing, because he doesn't know who or what it is that's beside him, who's in the darkness, invites him, "Tell me your sorrows." And Shasta can't see this creature, doesn't know who or what he's speaking to, is frankly still somewhat scared, but he starts to speak. He tells his sorrows, and he learns that he hasn't been alone. He learns that in his own particular journey, he actually has been accompanied all his life, even when he was a small child who almost died. But when he asks who he's talking to, the answer resounds with the three-person mystery at the heart of the Christian God. "Myself," said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook, and again, "Myself," loud and clear and gay, and then the third time, "Myself," whispered so softly you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around you, as if the leaves rustled with it. And when at last dawn has come and Shasta realises he is indeed talking to a lion, but a lion that is shining like the sun. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful. He falls to the ground. And the High King, above all kings, stooped towards him. Its mane and some strange and solemn perfume that hung about the mane was all around him. It touched his forehead with its tongue. He lifted his face and their eyes met. Then instantly the pale brightness of the mist and the fiery brightness of the lion rolled themselves together into a swirling glory and gathered themselves up and disappeared. And he was alone with the horse on a grassy hillside under a blue sky, and the birds were singing. Thank you.
If you have any questions, which I'm sure you do, can you raise your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone.
Do you think C.S. Lewis had all the Narnia books in his head originally, or did he come to the idea of writing Magician's Nephew later to explain some of the early ones?
I think almost The Magician's Nephew in a way kind of shows that he didn't have it all in his head and didn't have a plan. I think he talked about only doing 3. So it's not 100% clear, but I suspect he didn't plan to do 7.
Sharon, you said that he started writing the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe in 1939, but it didn't get published until 1950, so it's all through the war years. Was he developing it? Was he maybe telling the story in the journals of the story to the refugee children? Do we know how that whole 11 years worked through?
No, we don't actually know when he started getting the dreams or thinking that through. That what he did say in 1939 was that he was going to write a children's story. So there was some idea at some point there, but when the idea started to filter around his head, we don't know. We have no evidence. He threw everything out. He didn't keep things for the record. He burnt things, or got his brother to burn them for him. I know that Till We Have Faces, which is the late novel that I love, that was in his head for decades. Decades. Most of his life, really. But we don't know. It's a mystery.
Yeah.
There's one there as well, sorry. I'll come this way.
Hi, I was just interested in what you said about C.S. Lewis's participation with God, and I was thinking about God as being the great creator, as in the great inventor, and then being the discoverer. And I'm wondering, when he wrote C.S. Lewis the Narnia books, is he thinking along participation that he is writing the story and men are discovering it by reading it, which what you're saying is like he kept a lot of it secretive and expected the readers to delve into it and discover it for themselves?
Yeah, so you're asking me, did he expect us in a way to participate with him?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the same way that he participated with God as a sort of the great, as he was discovering God, people were discovering through him God, if that makes sense.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's a sculpting in East Belfast, which is near where he lived as a small child in particular, and it's called The Searcher, and it's an artist, a local artist, who made this very large, it's a wonderful statue of Diggory and the wardrobe, and it's got little quotations on it, but it's all about that idea that Noel Lewis was a searcher, but actually when you look at the sculpting, there's bits that are tiny that we're called, to look at, and so yes, you're absolutely right, I think, yeah, we have to do our work too, there's things hidden, and medieval people that he would have studied also didn't think you had to say everything kind of up front, that there was a hiddenness to things,
Hi Sharon, thank you. I could listen to you reading Narnia forever, I think. What do you think of that all the Narnia books were aligned with the planets, like Michael Ward wrote about?
I read it and was quite convinced by it. There was a lot of so Michael Ward wrote a book saying that each of the Narnia stories can be, you can see a particular planet in it, and I can't even remember them now, which one's Venus and which one, I can't remember them, it's a while since I read it. It's a substantial book and it's very convincing, except because there's so many references to the planets. But is that the schema by which the 7 books hangs? I don't know. People have had lots of theories over the 7 books, that this thing with that thing, the other thing. Does that one finally land? I'm not 100% sure. Although he definitely shows a lot of the depth. It's a good book to show the kind of hiddenness and the depth that there is in Lewis. It really did unpack that, I think, for people. Don't know if that answers you. Kind of. Anybody else?
Thank you, Sharon. That was fantastic. I'd just like to know what you think about trying to film the Narnia books. I've seen the ones that they've done so far, and it kind of left me a bit cold. And the thing that I've loved most of all is the little cartoon of the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which to me left enough to the imagination to kind of make it really worth doing. But I wonder what you thought about the Netflix plans to film them.
So Lewis himself, he wasn't really keen on sort of things being put to Disney stuff. He didn't really want that. He obviously didn't mind the books being illustrated because he has Pauline Baines, I had 1 or 2 of those, I think, in the slides. So he doesn't mind some level of, but I do think there is a limitation to being given the visual version, and I definitely am pretty sure I won't like the Greta Gerwig version. I'm pretty sure I won't. because I'd be surprised if she really, you know, gets on board with him. She does her own thing. She reinterprets. You know, so and then we'll get annoyed with that probably. But we'll see. It could be brilliant if you just take it as a right. But yeah, I'm generally a bit disappointed too. I think I quite like the more recent Man, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but by the time they got to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I think it was definitely, yeah. So if you can set them aside as kind of their own thing, yeah. But books are always better, don't you think?